My name is Sarah Mitchell. I command nuclear submarines in the Pacific Fleet. I have briefed Pentagon officials on matters of national security. But at my sister's wedding, I was treated like the family embarrassment who didn't belong at the reception table. Emily's big day was supposed to be perfect. Rose petals scattered across manicured lawns, crystal chandeliers hanging from silk-draped pavilions, and 300 guests dressed in their finest attire. Everything orchestrated to showcase the Mitchell family's success in Portland's elite social circle. Everything except me. I stood at the edge of the reception, watching my family glide through conversations with practiced ease. My mother, Patricia, air-kissed her way through clusters of well-dressed friends, her diamond bracelet catching the evening light. My father, Robert, commanded attention near the bar, regaling business associates with stories about real estate deals and country club politics. And my sister Emily, radiant in her designer gown, floated from table to table like she was born to be the center of attention. But when their eyes fell on me, the warmth disappeared. The smiles became forced. The conversations grew quieter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there from the moment I arrived at Riverside Country Club that morning. My mother's tight smile when she spotted my rental car in the parking lot. My father's barely concealed sigh when I approached the family photos. Emily's quick glance toward her bridesmaids, followed by nervous laughter. They had hoped I wouldn't make it. Another deployment, another military obligation that would keep me conveniently absent from their perfect day. But I had moved mountains to be here, rearranged classified briefings, handed off crucial operations to my deputy, and caught 3 connecting flights to make it from Norfolk to Portland, in time for my only sister's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could coordinate multi-billion-dollar naval operations across international waters, but I couldn't navigate a simple family gathering without feeling like an outsider. It started during the cocktail hour. I wore my dress blues, pressed to perfection, ribbons aligned with military precision. It was appropriate attire for a formal military officer attending a family wedding. But the way my relatives looked at me, you'd think I had shown up in combat fatigues covered in mud. Uncle Tom approached first, his face already flushed from the open bar. "Sarah, couldn't you have worn something more normal? This is a wedding, not a military parade." His voice carried just loud enough for nearby guests to overhear. Aunt Linda joined him, shaking her head with that familiar look of disappointment I remembered from childhood gatherings. "Poor Emily. She specifically asked for elegant attire, and you show up looking like you're reporting for duty. Some things never change." I kept my composure, hands clasped behind my back in a stance that had become second nature after 2 decades of service. "This is formal military dress for special occasions. It's perfectly appropriate." But they had already moved on, dismissing me with the same casual indifference I'd grown accustomed to over the years. To them, I would always be the daughter who chose duty over family expectations, the sister who picked submarines over suburbs, the woman who traded designer dresses for military uniforms. The real blow came during the reception dinner. I had been assigned to table 12. Tucked away in the back corner with distant relatives and +1s nobody knew quite what to do with. Meanwhile, my parents presided over the head table with Emily and David, surrounded by Portland's social elite and successful business leaders. From my distant vantage point, I watched my father stand to give his toast. His voice boomed across the pavilion, carried by expensive sound equipment and amplified by his natural commanding presence in rooms like this. "Emily has always been our pride and joy," he began, raising his champagne flute toward the head table. "From her first piano recital to her interior design business success, she's brought nothing but honor to the Mitchell name. She chose a path that keeps her close to family, close to the values we raised her with." The crowd murmured approval. Glasses clinked. Emily beamed. But I noticed what he didn't say. No mention of his other daughter. No acknowledgement of the Mitchells serving her country. No recognition of the sacrifices made in uniform. Just careful silence where my existence might have been acknowledged. My table companions shifted uncomfortably. A few glanced in my direction, recognizing the obvious omission. One elderly woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something I couldn't quite catch, but her sympathetic expression said enough. I took a sip of water, my throat suddenly dry. This was nothing new. Growing up, Emily had been the golden child who excelled at everything that mattered to Robert and Patricia Mitchell. Piano lessons, dance recitals, art classes, social events. She moved through their world with grace and ease, naturally fitting into the role they had envisioned for both their daughters. I had tried to follow that path once. Attempted the piano lessons, enrolled in the same private school, worn the same style of dresses to family functions. But something inside me always felt restless. Always yearned for something beyond Portland's comfortable social boundaries. The night I announced my intention to attend the Naval Academy, the silence around our dining room table stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Emily had been 17 then, already planning her college major in design and talking about internships with local firms. I was 19, determined to serve something larger than myself. "The military?" my mother had finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, you're brilliant. You could do anything. Why would you choose something so limiting?" My father had been more direct. "The Mitchell family builds things, Sarah. We create businesses, develop properties, contribute to our community. We don't abandon our responsibilities to play soldier." But I hadn't been playing. 23 years later, sitting at table 12 while my family celebrated my sister's perfect day, I carried 2 stars on my uniform and commanded more responsibility than any Mitchell before me had ever imagined. Yet in their eyes, I remained the daughter who had chosen wrong, the sister who had disappointed them by refusing to stay in the carefully constructed world they had built. The evening continued to unfold exactly as I had expected, yet somehow each moment still managed to sting with fresh humiliation. After the toast concluded and the dancing began, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Found myself standing alone near the garden's edge, watching couples sway beneath the string lights while my family mingled effortlessly with their guests. Emily floated across the dance floor in her flowing gown, every movement graceful and rehearsed. She had always possessed that natural elegance our mother prized so highly, the ability to command attention without seeming to try. Her laugh carried across the pavilion, bright and musical, drawing admiring glances from wedding guests who undoubtedly saw her as the perfect bride, the ideal daughter, the Mitchell family success story. David, her new husband, spun her gently under the lights, his face glowing with genuine adoration. I had to admit they made a striking couple. He worked as a civilian contractor now, something involving logistics and supply chain management for various government agencies. His background remained somewhat vague whenever family conversations touched on his career, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that reminded me of officers I had served alongside. When Emily had first introduced him 18 months ago, something about his posture had caught my attention. The way he stood at attention without realizing it, the precise way he arranged items on tables, the respectful distance he maintained when speaking with older relatives. These were habits carved deep by military training, the kind that never fully disappear even years after discharge. But tonight he seemed focused entirely on Emily, completely absorbed in making her wedding day everything she had dreamed it would be. I respected that dedication, even as I felt increasingly invisible at the edges of their celebration. My mother approached during a lull in the music, her silk dress rustling against the wooden deck. She carried herself with the practiced poise of someone who had spent decades hosting charity events and country club functions. Her jewelry caught the ambient lighting perfectly, each piece carefully selected to complement her ensemble without appearing ostentatious. "Sarah, darling," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for addressing uncomfortable subjects. "Perhaps you could help me understand something. Why did you feel it necessary to wear your uniform tonight?" Emily specifically requested elegant cocktail attire for the reception. I kept my expression neutral, drawing on years of experience maintaining composure under pressure. "This is formal military dress, Mother. It's appropriate for special occasions and family celebrations." She sighed softly, glancing around to ensure our conversation remained private. "You know how important appearances are at events like this. Our guests expect a certain level of sophistication. Emily has worked so hard to create the perfect atmosphere." The implication hung between us like smoke. My uniform, my service, my entire career was somehow beneath their social standards. I represented an embarrassment they had to manage rather than a daughter they could celebrate. "I've attended state dinners in this uniform," I said quietly. "I've worn it to ceremonies honoring fallen heroes and diplomatic receptions with foreign dignitaries. I thought it would be appropriate for my sister's wedding." Patricia's expression softened slightly, but her message remained unchanged. "Of course your service is admirable, dear, but tonight is about Emily. Perhaps next time you could choose something more in keeping with family expectations." She drifted away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone with the familiar weight of disappointment settling across my shoulders. This conversation had played out countless times over the years, in different settings with slight variations, but always carrying the same underlying message. I was the daughter who consistently failed to meet their standards, who chose obligations that took me away from family gatherings, who refused to embrace the lifestyle they had carefully constructed. The band transitioned into a slower song, and I watched my father escort Emily onto the dance floor for the traditional father-daughter dance. Robert moved with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his time behind a desk, guiding Emily through practice steps they had obviously rehearsed. The photographers circled them carefully, capturing every angle of this picture-perfect moment. Other family members gathered around the dance floor's perimeter, phones raised to record the scene. Aunts dabbed at their eyes with cocktail napkins. Uncles nodded approvingly. Everyone seemed genuinely moved by the touching display of paternal pride and daughterly devotion. I remained at my distance, hands clasped behind my back, observing the scene like an outsider looking through a window at someone else's family celebration. Because that's exactly what I was. Despite sharing DNA and childhood memories with these people, I had become a stranger in their world, someone whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. When the song ended, applause rippled through the crowd. Emily hugged our father tightly, and he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. The photographer captured that moment too, preserving it for the wedding album that would sit on their coffee table for decades to come. As guests returned to their conversations and the evening's festivities resumed, I noticed David standing alone near the head table, apparently taking a brief break from his hosting duties. He loosened his tie slightly and scanned the reception area with careful attention, the way someone might survey a perimeter or assess a situation for potential complications. Our eyes met across the pavilion, and he offered a polite nod. I returned the gesture, maintaining the formal courtesy expected at such gatherings. But something in his expression seemed different from the dismissive glances I had received from other family members throughout the evening. His attention lingered longer than necessary, taking in details of my uniform with what appeared to be recognition rather than judgment. Before I could analyze his reaction further, Emily appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his and drawing his attention back to their wedding guests. She whispered something that made him smile, and they moved together toward a group of her college friends who were gesturing enthusiastically near the dessert table. The moment passed quickly, but it left me with an odd sense of curiosity. Most civilians barely noticed military uniforms beyond their obvious symbolism. They might express general appreciation for service members without understanding the specific significance of ribbons, insignia, or rank indicators. But David's glance had carried the weight of someone who recognized exactly what he was seeing. I dismissed the thought and turned my attention back to surviving the remainder of the evening with as much dignity as possible. The reception would continue for several more hours, filled with more dancing, more toasts, and more opportunities for my family to demonstrate how little I belonged in their carefully orchestrated world. A waiter passed nearby carrying a tray of champagne flutes, and I accepted one despite having little appetite for celebration. The bubbles tickled my throat as I took a small sip, watching the festivities continue around me like a movie I was viewing rather than experiencing. This was my reality. This was what family gatherings had become. Beautiful events filled with people who shared my history but no longer shared my life. Celebrations where my achievements were ignored, my sacrifices were dismissed, and my presence was barely tolerated. But I had learned to carry that weight, without letting it destroy me. 23 years of military service had taught me the difference between battles worth fighting and situations that required strategic patience. Tonight called for patience. Tomorrow I would return to my real life, my real responsibilities, my real purpose. Tonight I would endure their subtle rejection one more time, knowing it would likely be the last family gathering I would choose to attend. The moment everything changed began quietly, almost imperceptibly. I was standing near the rose garden, holding my untouched champagne and watching the Portland skyline twinkle in the distance, when I heard footsteps approaching on the gravel path behind me. The measured cadence was familiar, purposeful without being hurried. David appeared at my side, having excused himself from an animated conversation with Emily's sorority sisters. Up close, I could see the subtle signs I had noticed earlier: the way he held his shoulders, the unconscious habit of scanning his surroundings, the precise alignment of his collar despite hours of celebration. These were markers carved by years of military discipline, details that civilians rarely noticed, but were unmistakable to those who shared the experience. "Admiral Mitchell," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of respect I hadn't heard from anyone else at this gathering. "I hope you don't mind the interruption." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they carried recognition that had been absent from every other interaction tonight. He hadn't called me Sarah, or Emily's sister, or simply ma'am the way most people addressed women they didn't know well. He had used my rank, my proper title, the designation I had earned through decades of service and sacrifice. I turned to face him fully, studying his expression in the soft garden lighting. His eyes held a seriousness that seemed at odds with the celebratory atmosphere surrounding us. But his posture remained respectful, almost formal, despite the casual wedding setting. "You don't mind at all," I replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation might lead. "Though I'm curious how you knew my rank. Emily typically doesn't share details about my career with her social circle." A slight smile crossed his features, carrying something that looked like understanding mixed with regret. "I recognize the ribbons, ma'am. The Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit with Combat Distinguishing Device, the Navy Commendation Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters. That's not the kind of chest candy someone earns behind a desk." The champagne glass trembled slightly in my hand. In 30 seconds, this man had demonstrated more knowledge about my service record than my family had accumulated in 23 years. He wasn't just making polite conversation or offering generic appreciation for military service. He was reading my uniform like a detailed resume, understanding the story told by each ribbon, each insignia, each carefully placed element of my dress blues. "You served," I said. It wasn't a question. "Navy, 8 years. Enlisted, then officer through the commissioning program. I spent most of my time on destroyers in the Pacific Fleet before transitioning to civilian contracting." He paused, glancing back toward the reception where Emily was laughing with a group of college friends. "I've heard about Admiral Sarah Mitchell. Your work in naval intelligence, the submarine operations you've commanded. The community isn't that large, ma'am. Your reputation precedes you." The world seemed to shift beneath my feet. Here, at my sister's wedding, surrounded by family members who treated my career like an embarrassing hobby, stood someone who actually understood what I had accomplished. Someone who recognized the significance of the decorations I wore, who knew enough about military structure to comprehend what it meant for a woman to reach flag rank in submarine warfare. "Emily never mentioned your background," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. David's expression grew more serious, and he glanced around to ensure our conversation remained private. "There are aspects of my work that don't come up in casual conversation, but when Emily told me her sister was a Navy officer, I did some research. What I found was impressive. And when I realized you'd be here tonight, I hoped for the chance to pay my respects properly." The irony was staggering. My own family had spent the evening treating me like an unwelcome guest whose presence disrupted their perfect celebration, while Emily's new husband recognized achievements they couldn't be bothered to understand. The contrast felt surreal, like stepping between two completely different realities. I appreciate that, I said, though the words felt inadequate. Though I have to admit, it's somewhat surprising to encounter someone at a Portland Country Club reception who knows anything about Pacific Fleet operations. My current contracting work keeps me connected to military circles. I maintain security clearances, work with defense logistics, interface with active duty personnel regularly. When someone mentions Admiral Mitchell from submarine warfare, that name carries weight in certain communities. He spoke with the kind of measured precision that suggested classified work, the careful word choices of someone accustomed to navigating sensitive information. I recognized the pattern because I lived it daily, the constant awareness of what could be said, when, and to whom. "Your family seems lovely," he continued, though something in his tone suggested he had observed more than casual pleasantries during the evening's festivities. "Emily speaks about them often." I couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh, though it carried no humor. "I imagine she does, though probably not about me." David studied my face for a moment, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "She mentions that you're often deployed, that your schedule makes family gatherings difficult. She wishes you could be around more." "That's a diplomatic way of describing their perspective," I replied. "The reality is somewhat different. My family views my career as an unfortunate choice that takes me away from more important obligations. They've made it clear that my priorities don't align with their expectations." "With respect, ma'am, that's their loss." The simple statement carried more validation than I had received from my family in decades. Coming from someone who understood military service, who recognized what flag rank represented, who could read the story written across my uniform, those 4 words held tremendous weight. "Emily seems happy," I said, changing the subject before the emotion building in my chest could overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. "She is, and I intend to keep it that way." His tone carried the kind of quiet conviction that suggested absolute commitment. "She's an extraordinary woman. Talented, creative, devoted to the people she cares about. I consider myself incredibly fortunate." I nodded, appreciating his obvious devotion to my sister, even as I wondered how much Emily truly understood about the man she had married. His background suggested complexities that didn't typically surface in the social circles she preferred, experiences that might not align with the comfortable world our family had constructed. "Have you told her about your military background?" I asked. "She knows I served. The details aren't something we discuss frequently. Her interests lie elsewhere, and I respect that. My focus now is building a civilian life with her, contributing to the community she values." There was something admirable about his willingness to set aside his own history to embrace Emily's world, even as I wondered whether that kind of fundamental disconnect might create problems down the road. But tonight wasn't the time for such considerations. Tonight was about celebrating their union and supporting their happiness. "I should return to the reception," David said after a moment. "Emily will be looking for me soon, and I don't want to keep you from the celebration any longer than necessary." "Of course. Thank you for the conversation. It's been enlightening." He nodded once, a gesture that carried military crispness despite his civilian attire. "The honor was mine, Admiral, truly." As he turned to leave, I felt compelled to add something more. "David, take care of her. Emily deserves happiness." "Absolutely, ma'am. You have my word." He walked back toward the pavilion with that same measured stride, rejoining the celebration as seamlessly as he had departed. Within moments, Emily was at his side again, slipping her hand into his and drawing him back into conversations with wedding guests who had no idea they were speaking with someone who understood warfare, classified operations, and the weight of command responsibility. I remained in the garden, processing what had just occurred. In the span of 10 minutes, my understanding of the evening had shifted dramatically. Emily's husband wasn't just another civilian contractor with vague government connections. He was someone who moved in circles that intersected with my world, someone who recognized achievements my own family couldn't be bothered to acknowledge. The revelation left me feeling oddly displaced, caught between relief at finally encountering recognition and frustration that it had come from a virtual stranger rather than the people who were supposed to know me best. David's respectful acknowledgement highlighted just how completely my family had failed to understand or appreciate the life I had built beyond their social boundaries. But it also planted a seed of something I hadn't expected. Hope that perhaps Emily's future might include someone who could bridge the gap between their civilian world and my military reality. Someone who understood both sides well enough to translate between them when necessary. The revelation about David's background sent my mind spiraling back through decades of memories, searching for patterns I might have missed. Moments when my family's treatment of my choices had crystallized into the dismissive attitude that now defined our relationship. Standing in that garden, champagne growing warm in my forgotten glass, I found myself remembering the exact moment when everything had shifted irrevocably. I was 12 years old, sitting in our family's formal living room on Maple Street, surrounded by relatives who had gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. The house smelled like roasted turkey and my mother's famous cranberry sauce, and the adults were engaged in their traditional post-meal conversation about local politics, business developments, and family updates. Emily, only 5 at the time, had fallen asleep in our father's lap, her small body curled against his chest while he absently stroked her hair. She looked angelic in her velvet dress, tiny patent leather shoes still perfectly polished despite a full day of festivities. Everyone commented on how beautiful she was, how sweet, how perfectly behaved. I sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, still wearing my own carefully selected outfit, but somehow feeling invisible, despite being in the same room. The adults' conversation flowed around me without acknowledgement, as if I were simply part of the furniture, rather than a family member worth including. Uncle Tom had been holding forth about his latest business acquisition when the conversation turned to current events. Someone mentioned the Persian Gulf War, which had dominated news coverage throughout the year. The adults discussed it with the casual detachment of people whose lives remained comfortably insulated from such distant conflicts. "Those poor soldiers," Aunt Linda had said, shaking her head sympathetically. "I can't imagine choosing such a dangerous career. Thank goodness our children will have better options." Something stirred inside my 12-year-old chest, a feeling I couldn't yet articulate but would later recognize as the first stirring of purpose. While my relatives spoke about military service as something unfortunate that happened to other people's children, I found myself wondering about the men and women who chose to serve, who put themselves in harm's way to protect freedoms that families like mine took for granted. "I think it's brave," I had said quietly, my voice barely audible over the adult conversation. The room fell silent, every head turned toward me, expressions ranging from surprise to mild amusement. My father's eyebrows rose slightly, and my mother's smile took on that particular quality she reserved for correcting inappropriate behavior. "What did you say, sweetheart?" my mother asked, her tone gentle but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "I said I think it's brave," I repeated louder this time. "The soldiers, I mean. They're protecting us. That seems important." Uncle Tom chuckled, the kind of indulgent laugh adults used when children said something cute but naive. "Well, of course it's important, Sarah, but it's not something people like us need to worry about. We contribute to society in other ways, better ways." "What do you mean, people like us?" I asked, genuinely, confused by the distinction he seemed to be making. My father shifted Emily's sleeping form and leaned forward slightly. "The Mitchell family has always been about building things, Sarah. Creating businesses, developing properties, contributing to our community's growth. Military service is admirable, certainly, but it's not our path. We have responsibilities here, obligations to maintain what previous generations have built." Even at 12, I sensed there was something fundamentally wrong with that perspective, though I lacked the vocabulary to challenge it effectively. The idea that service to country was somehow beneath our family's social status felt alien to everything I had been taught about patriotism and civic duty. "But someone has to do it," I persisted, unable to let the subject drop despite the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere in the room. "If everyone like us decides they're too important for military service, who protects the country?" The silence that followed felt different from the first. This wasn't amusement or gentle correction. This was disapproval, the kind of sharp-edged tension that children learn to recognize as dangerous territory. My mother stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt with practiced movements. "Sarah, perhaps you should help me clear the dinner dishes." The adults need to finish their conversation. It was a dismissal disguised as a request for assistance, a polite way of removing me from a discussion I was disrupting with inappropriate questions. But even as I obediently collected plates and glasses, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been revealed about my family's values, something that didn't align with the principles I thought we shared. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its carefully coordinated wallpaper and matching curtains, I had stared at the ceiling and wondered why wanting to serve my country felt like betraying my family. The disconnect made no sense to my 12-year-old mind, but it planted seeds of understanding that would take years to fully germinate. The pattern established that Thanksgiving continued throughout my adolescence. When I expressed interest in military history, my parents suggested I focus on more practical subjects. When I mentioned admiring female officers I had read about, they redirected my attention toward successful businesswomen in their social circle. When I started researching service academies during high school, they enrolled me in additional college preparatory courses designed to enhance my application to prestigious civilian universities. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to instinctively understand what our parents wanted. She gravitated toward activities they valued: art classes, piano lessons, social events that connected her with the right peer groups. She possessed an innate grace that made her the center of attention wherever she went, combined with a social intelligence that allowed her to navigate complex family dynamics without creating tension. I loved my sister, but I couldn't be her. Every attempt to follow her path felt forced, artificial, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. While she thrived in the spotlight our parents provided, I felt most comfortable in quieter moments, reading about places beyond Portland's comfortable boundaries, imagining challenges that demanded more than social graces and business acumen. The final confrontation came during my senior year of high school, when I announced my intention to apply to the Naval Academy. I had prepared for months, researching requirements, improving my physical fitness, seeking recommendations from teachers who understood my goals. The application process was rigorous, demanding, everything I had hoped it would be. When I told my parents over dinner one evening in February, their reaction exceeded even my worst expectations. My father's fork clattered against his plate, and my mother's face went completely pale. Emily, then a sophomore, looked back and forth between us with growing alarm. "Absolutely not," my father said, his voice carrying an authority I had never heard him use before. "I will not allow you to throw away your future on some misguided notion of patriotic duty." "It's not misguided," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear building in my chest. "It's what I want to do with my life. It's what feels right to me." My mother reached across the table, covering my hand with hers in a gesture that felt more restraining than comforting. "Sarah, darling, you're 18. You don't understand the implications of this decision. Military service is for people who don't have other options. You have every advantage, every opportunity. Why would you choose to limit yourself?" "I'm not limiting myself. I'm choosing to serve something larger than my own comfortable existence." The words came out harsher than I had intended, carrying an implicit criticism of their lifestyle that I immediately regretted, but I couldn't take them back, and the damage was immediate and visible. My father's expression hardened completely. "If you pursue this path, Sarah, you'll be doing it without family support, financial, emotional, or otherwise. The Mitchell name means something in this community, and I won't have it associated with decisions that reflect poorly on our judgment as parents." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Choose family or choose service, but not both. Conform to their expectations or forfeit your place in their world. Emily had started crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized our family was fracturing before her eyes. She was too young to understand the deeper issues at stake, but old enough to recognize that something irreparable was happening. I looked around the dinner table, at the faces of people I loved but who couldn't love me as I was, only as they wanted me to be. The choice they were forcing felt impossible, but in that moment I realized it had already been made long ago, during countless smaller moments when my dreams had been dismissed, my interests redirected, my authentic self gradually erased in favor of their preferred version. "Then I guess I'll be doing it without family support," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tears I was fighting back. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Emily's soft sobbing and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. In that moment, At 18 years old, I learned that love could be conditional, that family could be fragile, and that sometimes the price of being true to yourself was higher than you ever imagined paying. I followed through on my decision despite their opposition. The Naval Academy accepted my application, and I left Portland that August with a single duffel bag and a determination forged by necessity rather than choice. My parents didn't attend my graduation from high school, claiming prior commitments that suddenly couldn't be rearranged. Emily hugged me goodbye at the airport, her 15-year-old face streaked with tears she didn't fully understand. "Will you come back?" she whispered as my boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. "I'll always be your sister," I told her, though even then I suspected our relationship would never be the same. The years that followed proved me right. I excelled at the academy, graduated with honors, and began climbing the ranks with a focus that bordered on obsession. Every promotion, every commendation, every successful mission felt like validation of the choice I had made against my family's wishes. But the silence from home grew deeper with each passing year. I sent letters during my midshipman years describing life at Annapolis, sharing stories about my classmates and the challenges we faced together. The responses, when they came at all, were brief and polite, like correspondence with a distant acquaintance rather than family. My mother would update me on Emily's activities, her success in college, her internships with prestigious design firms. My father would mention business developments, community events, mutual acquaintances from Portland's social scene. But they never asked about my experiences, never inquired about my studies, my training, my aspirations within the Navy. It was as if they had collectively decided that acknowledging my military career would somehow legitimize a choice they refused to accept. When I graduated from the Naval Academy, I sent them an invitation to the commissioning ceremony. The silence that followed felt different from their usual delayed responses. It was deliberate, pointed, a conscious decision to ignore one of the most significant moments of my young adult life. I stood on the parade deck that day, surrounded by classmates whose families had traveled from across the country to witness their children become naval officers. Parents beamed with pride, siblings cheered from the stands, grandparents wiped away tears of joy. I scanned the crowd repeatedly, harboring some desperate hope that they might surprise me, that blood would prove thicker than disappointment. They never came. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was born that day, not just through the official ceremony, but through the final acceptance that I would build my life without the foundation most people took for granted. Family approval, parental pride, sibling support, these became luxuries I would have to live without. My early assignments took me to ships and bases across the Pacific, each deployment adding distance not just in miles but in understanding. I developed expertise in naval intelligence, submarine warfare, strategic planning. My superiors praised my analytical skills, my leadership potential, my ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. But when I called home to share these achievements, the conversations felt hollow, performative. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say when I mentioned a particularly challenging assignment I had completed successfully. "Emily just got promoted to senior designer at her firm. She's working on some beautiful projects for high-profile clients." The contrast was always implied, but never stated directly. Emily's accomplishments mattered because they aligned with their values, contributed to their social standing, reflected positively on their parenting. My achievements, no matter how significant, remained irrelevant to their definition of success. Over the years, I stopped sharing professional updates. Phone calls became shorter, less frequent. I sent holiday cards and birthday gifts, maintained the minimal courtesies expected of family relationships, but I gradually let go of any expectation that they would celebrate my life or understand my choices. The real betrayal came during my commander years, when I was serving aboard a nuclear submarine in the South Pacific. I had been promoted ahead of my peers, selected for increasingly challenging positions, marked as a rising star within the submarine community. The responsibilities were enormous, the pressure constant, but I thrived in that environment of precision and purpose. I was underwater for 3 months during a classified mission when the emergency communication came through official channels. My grandfather, my father's father, had died suddenly of a heart attack. The message included details about funeral arrangements, family gathering plans, and a request for emergency leave if I wanted to attend. Frank Mitchell had been the one family member who seemed to understand my choices. even if he couldn't openly support them given my parents' strong opposition. During childhood visits to his house, he would tell stories about serving in World War II, about the pride he felt in uniform, about the satisfaction that came from duty fulfilled. He never explicitly encouraged my military aspirations, but he never dismissed them either. I submitted the emergency leave request immediately, knowing it would require complex logistical arrangements to extract me from our current mission and transport me back to Portland in time for the funeral. My commanding officer expedited the paperwork, understanding that family emergencies took precedence over operational considerations. But when I arrived in Portland 36 hours later, exhausted from the hurried travel but determined to pay my respects, I discovered that the funeral had been moved up 2 days. No one had bothered to inform me through military channels. No one had attempted to coordinate the timing with my availability. I called my mother from the airport, hoping there might be some misunderstanding, some way to participate in memorial services even though I had missed the main ceremony. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying surprise rather than grief. "I didn't expect you to actually make it. Military schedules are so unpredictable, and we couldn't delay the arrangements for uncertain travel plans." The casual dismissal hit me harder than any previous slight. They had deliberately excluded me from my grandfather's funeral, the one family member who might have wanted me there, rather than risk any inconvenience to their carefully planned event. "He would have wanted me there," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "Of course, dear. But Frank would have understood that duty comes first. He was military himself, after all. He knew how these things work." The irony was devastating. They were using my commitment to service, the very quality they had always criticized, as justification for excluding me from a ceremony honoring a man who had served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. I hung up the phone and sat in the rental car outside the airport, staring at the Portland skyline through rain-streaked windows. That was the moment I finally understood that reconciliation was impossible. They would never accept me as I was, never acknowledge my achievements as valid, never include me as an equal member of their family. The years that followed brought rapid professional advancement, but continued personal isolation. I made captain at an unusually young age, commanded multiple vessels, earned recognition for innovative tactical approaches, and exceptional leadership under pressure. My peers respected me, my subordinates trusted me, my superiors valued my expertise. But I attended military ceremonies alone. I spent holidays on duty or in solitude. I built professional relationships that sometimes approached friendship, but I never fully trusted anyone with the depth of my family estrangement. When Emily called to tell me about David, I was serving as a newly promoted Rear Admiral, working out of the Pentagon on strategic planning initiatives. She sounded genuinely happy, describing their courtship with enthusiasm I hadn't heard in her voice since childhood. "He's perfect for me," she said during one of our infrequent phone conversations. "He understands my work, supports my ambitions, makes me laugh. I think you'd like him, Sarah. He's very respectful, very serious about commitment." I found myself hoping that David would be different from the men Emily had dated previously, the ones who treated her like an ornament for their own ambitions, rather than recognizing her genuine talents. She deserved someone who would value her creativity, support her independence, appreciate her intelligence. "I'm happy for you," I told her, meaning it despite the distance between us. "When's the wedding?" "Next spring. We're planning something elegant but not too large. Family and close friends at Riverside Country Club. You'll get an invitation, of course, but I know your schedule makes it difficult to commit to these things." The qualification stung because it contained just enough truth to be defensible. My military obligations did require flexibility, did occasionally conflict with family events. But the real issue wasn't scheduling. It was their consistent failure to make me feel genuinely welcome. "I'll do my best to be there," I said, already knowing I would rearrange whatever necessary to attend. Emily was still my sister, regardless of our parents' attitudes, and her wedding represented one of the most important moments of her life. When the invitation arrived 3 months later, I was surprised by the formal tone. Most wedding invitations from family members carried personal notes, informal updates, expressions of hope that the recipient could attend. Emily's invitation was professionally printed, formally worded, identical to what she probably sent to distant relatives and business acquaintances. But I RSVP'd affirmatively and began planning for what I knew would be a challenging day. I selected my dress blue uniform carefully, ensuring every detail met the highest standards of military appearance. If I was going to attend as the family outsider, I would at least do so with dignity and precision. Now standing in the garden at Emily's reception, processing David's unexpected recognition of my achievements, I found myself wondering whether this wedding might mark a turning point in family dynamics. His military background created possibilities for understanding that hadn't existed before. Perhaps Emily's marriage would introduce someone who could translate between our two worlds. But even as hope stirred cautiously in my chest, I remained realistic about the challenges ahead. 25 years of family dysfunction couldn't be resolved by a single conversation with my sister's new husband. The patterns were too entrenched, the wounds too deep, the fundamental value differences too significant. The evening continued around me as I stood in contemplation, guests dancing and laughing while I processed the unexpected encounter with someone who actually understood my world. David had returned to his hosting duties, but I noticed him glancing in my direction occasionally, as if checking to ensure I was managing the social dynamics adequately. As the reception began winding down and guests started making their departures, I prepared to say my goodbyes and return to my hotel. The evening had been less painful than anticipated, largely due to David's recognition, but I was ready for solitude and reflection. Emily approached as I gathered my small purse and prepared to leave, her face glowing with the happiness of a bride whose perfect day had unfolded exactly as planned. Her wedding dress remained pristine despite hours of celebration, her makeup still flawless, her energy seemingly inexhaustible. "Sarah, thank you so much for coming," she said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "I know it meant a lot to Mom and Dad to have the whole family here." I returned the hug, choosing not to challenge her perception of our parents' feelings about my presence. This was her day, her moment of joy, and I wouldn't taint it with family politics or personal grievances. "David seems wonderful," I told her honestly. "I'm genuinely happy for you both." "He is wonderful. And he was so excited to meet you. He kept asking questions about your career, wanting to make sure he said the right things. I think he was a little nervous about talking to a real admiral." The comment revealed more than Emily probably intended. David's nervousness hadn't been about rank or protocol. It had been about showing proper respect to someone whose achievements he understood and valued. The distinction mattered enormously, even if my sister couldn't grasp its significance. "He handled himself perfectly," I assured her. "You chose well." We stood together for a moment in comfortable silence, two sisters who had traveled very different paths but shared an unbreakable genetic bond. Despite everything that had driven us apart, despite the family dynamics that had made us strangers, I loved Emily and wanted her happiness. "Maybe we can stay in touch better now," she said hesitantly. "With David in my life, maybe family gatherings will be easier. He wants to include everyone, make sure nobody feels left out." The optimism in her voice was touching, even though I suspected she didn't fully understand the depth of the divisions she was hoping to bridge. But David's military background and obvious respect for service might indeed create new possibilities for connection. "I'd like that," I said simply, meaning it while remaining cautious about expectations. As I drove back to my hotel through Portland's quiet streets, I reflected on the evening's unexpected developments. David's recognition had provided validation I hadn't anticipated, while Emily's hopeful comments suggested potential for gradual healing of family relationships. But the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. My parents still viewed my career as an unfortunate aberration from family expectations. My achievements still felt irrelevant to their definition of success. My presence at family gatherings still carried the uncomfortable weight of disappointment and disapproval. However, for the first time in decades, I felt a small spark of possibility that the future might be different from the past. David's understanding created a bridge that hadn't existed before. Emily's happiness might motivate everyone to make more effort toward reconciliation. As I settled into my hotel room and began the process of transitioning back to my military mindset, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to attend a family gathering where my presence was genuinely welcomed. where my achievements were celebrated rather than tolerated, where being Admiral Sarah Mitchell was a source of pride rather than embarrassment for the people who shared my name. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed by past experience, but it was hope nonetheless. And after 25 years of family estrangement, even the smallest possibility of healing felt like a gift worth cherishing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.